Tani terang shuto ngacho Colorado lotra chimo girgan nambatang tani lomba nambala tomar shuto delaka samdriji yinsi.
First of all, I'd like to say good evening to all the students and teachers of Colorado University who have come here tonight.
Tani terang di kapsa tani sachan dela yungni tani nambatanche pola kabdan rishi gorkup tini shongwala ngarang pe gabo shong sonse.
And I'm extremely happy to have the opportunity coming here tonight to have this chance to engage in conversation with all of you.
Tani terang ngacho shito tani kabdashaya nangdund kangrezina ngacho nyarje ta karze kor teres.
And the topic of this evening's talk is compassion and vegetarianism.
And
of these two topics, what I'd really like to focus on is compassion. And the reason that I'd like to talk about compassion tonight is that in the course of our everyday lives, we don't always exercise much compassion.
So
rather than having compassion in our minds, we often have various other kinds of negative emotions or opposite emotions to compassion. So for our talk this evening, I'd like to present my ideas for 1 hour and about 20 minutes, and for the remaining 40 minutes we can engage in an exchange of ideas. So first of all, I'd like to talk about compassion. How do we define and understand compassion? In speaking of the connection between compassion and vegetarianism, in the Buddhist scripture, vegetarianism is often really talked of or spoken about in the context of compassion. Many people think that vegetarian is not something that has great relevance to their everyday lives, and compassion too, they also think is not something that is of absolute necessity. But in actual fact, this is not the case. Whether in actual fact we experience happiness in our daily lives really hinges on whether or not we exercise compassion. So there's an extremely close connection between vegetarianism and compassion. So in the Buddhist scriptures, one reason for vegetarianism is that by practicing a vegetarian lifestyle, we will be able to readily generate compassion.
Deni sem ganala yerdang mambo control mambo kia tela haliba tinilam dera chimbondos.
And by contrast, if we eat meat, then we will generate negative emotions such as anger and hatred, and so there is a very big connection indeed between our diet and our mental state.
Teni te lor tongcha ti tawati ti samloti lor tongcha ni ta ngabja kongla teni sanji shakta ba shapa samlores.
And this notion, this idea is something that has been around for 2,500 years since the time of the historical Buddha.
Teni tirb nishipanti nangla teni tsarg ba ti thola teni chorta zu shindus.
And then in the 20th century, scientists did research into this same issue.
Teni chorta da kandishi barezena teni purun zena goz purun de shirtang korang khayang zana cho teni mrgyang zana cho nika zana cho kwen teni go
the subject of their investigation was pigeons. Pigeons are birds that, under ordinary circumstances, can eat meat or can eat a vegetable diet.
Teni chorta de kandishi barezena teni purun ngabji shini purun ngabji tambatela teni chung yembine kamne teni shavjini teni yar chimbo re teni yamba ngabji tambatela chung yembi nerkamne teni shachik jang maza teni mrjuk tata jene teni chimbo rechar yar chimbo chak teni chimbo chak tsari nekamna teni nigati purun ngabji tamba shat zankan tada sha mazankan teni go shigala gandriduk teni tashushi pares.
And what their experience was separating the pigeons into two groups. The first group, which was fed a purely meat diet for its entire life, so from the time the pigeons were small until they were mature. And then the other group was fed on a solely grain diet for the same length of time. And then after a number of years, the two groups, their personality traits, their characters, as it were compared.
Teni chung yimbi nerkamni nrg maza teni shazankan ga teni puron teso teni chembo chak tsari nerkamsa teni kongcho chembo teni khtambo teni koso pansang shikla yena teni ta nzangmo shenkan teni hachang ga shika teni jongbo shika zipo teni changdzi shazankan teso.
And what they discovered was that the group of pigeons who were raised on a meat diet were extremely savage in their personalities. They demonstrated signs of aggression, often fought with each other.
Teni chung yimbi nerkamni sha mazang kenga teni puron teso teni yar chembo chaktsari nerkamna teni shiga hachang ga jambo teni koso nangla teni gyabri teni mogong kan teni ga halipa ga teni shiga jambo semina mar jewa o teni changdzi ti puro sha mazang ken teso.
Whereas the group of pigeons who were raised on a grain diet were very gentle and peaceable in nature and didn't fight among each other.
Tani ngabji thamba purun gya thamba te purun imbalan jandare simchung chikpareze tani ngabji thamba te korang shika gyongbo rewa tang ngabji thamba te shika yakbo rewi gyumsan te tani shazawa tang mazawa nika ma tokpa jambawi gyumsan chiwa yo mares.
So these pigeons were all the same species. There were 100 of them, and the only difference between them was the diet that they were raised on. And so this was really the determining factor for the difference in their personalities between those that were aggressive and violent and those who were gentle and peace-loving.
Tenti inni ngacho karzi ta zatona teni suso shika yakbo yongwa tang nyarji tang damba tenti yongwa tang teni karzi mazuna teni shika kyongbo yongwa tang shika sim hachang teni zmu diksip o tenti yongwa tela teni tsare ka tone ze gona tenti demba rachut o tenti shongwa res.
So the idea that eating a vegetarian diet produces positive results in terms of one's personality or character, and that eating a meat diet produces negative results is something that scientists in the 20th century were able to prove through scientific means.
Teni ngacho modang miwar ka teni mjirwa yenanja teni ngacho modang teni rangshung kam ka war ka mjirwa yenanja teni ngacho modang chokchak ka war ka mjirwa yenanja tin jerwati yakpuzu yongda mayong ngaso semla raglegres.
So whether or not the relationship between people, or between people and the environment, or people and and animals, ultimately whether the relationship between all of these is a positive one, is a good one, really depends on the human mind.
Tani dangaso tani sha mazawa tani tani yongsona tani ngaso mi semde tani ta jiwa yung konduzi tani ngaso sem ganala tani kongcho tani diksum sem majiwa tang tani nyangji tang jiwa tang jambo tang tani yongda mayongde tani ngaso shirtang ngaso mag shikala yang tani ragle konduzi yena yang ngaso tani mag shawadang shopatang tani magum chostendang mag zamadang tisola yang halipa ragle konduzi.
So while we usually understand a person's personality, whether they're gentle and calm and peaceful, or whether they're turbulent and angry and aggressive, we usually attribute these things to just the simple personality of a person. But in actual fact, these things also hinge upon the kinds of behavior that a person characteristically engages in, including the kind of diet they consume.
Tini nga chogo semte tini yakpo tangmo tini yongda mayongda nga chogo korigla yang ragleba yores.
And in fact, whether our personalities, our minds do achieve a good state is also reliant on the external environment.
Pena nga chogo khau ganangla tini ayangdong yangchi yang ayangdong te hajang mangbo yosona tini nga chogo sem pez tezma temmo yongwa rawda. Tini ayang long de tez nyong ra ko yena ripayar tammo yongwa raw tini yores. Aso karlang khau tela.
So, for example, in environments where there's a lot of an excess of oxygen in the air, then often our intellect or our mental capacities become dull. Whereas if we're in a situation where the oxygen is somewhat slightly lesser, then our mental faculties become sharper.
Teni ngaso runggun thombola teni to dronken ga renjak ba cho yina teni koran so kable mambo jamni rungola droni runggun thombo tela thon sungni ne kana teni ta runggun thombo teni mar ndujagna teni koso semde hal leba ga teni mar jiwa ngaso mchi shikbo na la teni nyamnyong yo mamnyong wa teni hajeng ga sem jiwa dang hajeng ga kibo teni yonggo yores renjak ba chola.
So mountain climbers who go through much arduous effort to reach the top of a mountain, upon doing so, often experience a profound sense of peacefulness flooding through their minds. And there are many people who really like this kind of lifestyle of mountaineering. And the reason for this is because in high altitude contexts or situations there is very little oxygen in the air. And on account of this, they're able to experience a feeling of great peacefulness and calmness in their minds.
Tini tetang javala pena pe devjinta tini ngaso jilla nyangji yung mayongda khongcho yung mayongda deso yang ngaso khorigla yang dera yore ngaso zamala yang dera yores.
So in a similar way to this example, whether or not we are compassionate and whether or not we have peaceful personalities and characters is also dependent on our external environment.
Tini yendi tini shad mambo zana tini 먹 셈거 나라 되니 셈 마지와당 되니 공주기 라보 된지진도 그래서.
And if one consumes a lot of meat, then it's very easy for one to become agitated and aggressive in one's personality and not be gentle and peaceful in their state of mind.
되니 샤드 마자나 가서 가르시드잖아. 되니 랑진기 되니 가서 셈 마라 제완라오다 되니 냐지께 고나 냐지테스 께 slamoda le labo goni 냐지 께용와 된지 판독 빼침보 요레스.
And eating a vegetarian diet is extremely beneficial in enabling us to attain a state of calmness and peacefulness in our minds, which makes it much easier for us to arouse compassion.
Teni karze ngacho teni karze zana ngacho khorig la phanto yo panjao ta teni ngacho lipo desang la phanto yo panjao ta teso sama hako jiringe shago mare ngacho sama hako res.
That vegetarianism is beneficial to the human body, that it's beneficial to the natural environment, are things that everybody knows, and so there's no great necessity for me to reiterate these reasons this evening.
Teni dangacho mon nam gena teni soso teni nyarji te mepi jimsenji teni ngacho mir ki logi thola teni jamnya mai ba le ka mambo le yoris.
However, on account of the lack of compassion among human beings, there are all kinds of atrocities that have been committed across human history.
Teni ngacho pe na logi thola teni pume ko thop thang rawata teni murg nakpo teni thop thang rawata teni ko thola ngacho logi ko thola le kan ra mambo jamnya mepi le ka mambo le yoris.
Whether it's in terms of women's oppression or the oppression of people of colour, there have been all kinds of extremely regrettable actions and episodes in human history.
Yena tetak tamchi pu thola teni ta samlo thola girchu jamni teni chamala teni thoptang channi tata teni jevzang ro yores.
However, having recognized this situation to some degree and having implemented reforms in these areas, we could say that the situation is increasingly getting better in these respects.
Yena tata ngacho teni samlo toni girchu jam mato wa ti kangrezena ngacho tata chokchakla teni te tartang de tendrola teni tartang de ngacho tartang ga toni girchu jam to yo mares.
But while our attitude to other human beings and reforming the way that they are treated has progressed significantly, there is one area in which our attitudes are extremely lacking, and that is our approach towards animals.
Teni ngacho nufshok teni rigne ga nang la ina teni ga samlo thola teni jamni mayin ba teni mambo shondus.
In terms of Western thought, there have been many areas of inequality.
Pena ngacho nufshok teni to rigne nufshok logi ga thola teni pome ta na kipani ka teni jamni mepi kaps teni pome chola teni namshi yota mezene ushok ligne teni ga logi shondus.
For example, there has been in the history of the West debate over whether or not women in fact have souls.
Teni terang ta ngacho teni to ta pamela namshi yota mezene teni shana ta matsama teni matsama ga terguchi jiris.
However, whether or not if we were to engage in this kind of conversation today, then everybody would think it absolutely ridiculous.
Reta logi ga tola teni tendro ta pomeni kala namshi yota mezene ushok lupa teni doa ushok pang de was.
However, in human history, there has been this debate about women, females, and animals.
Teni ngacho mun nakpo so teni zhangyok shi pi ne kurna teni ngacho nufshok teni yang chanrik pa kashi da teni chanyi rik pa kashi ga yang mun nakpo te mun ngoma marezi teni shandus.
In the history of Western science too, there have been people who have alleged at times that that African Americans, for example, or black people are somehow inferior.
Rete terang ngacho teni to ta tari ga mun nakpo te marezi na teni ngacho sama ga teni cherguchi gres.
However, if something similar was alleged today, then we would all find it absolutely unacceptable.
Teni tenja was ka teni nufshok un chanyi rik pa hali pa ka ta jan dikar khorang ga teni ta chokshak chola teni namshi yo marezi teni shadus tendrola.
Descartes, a very famous Western philosopher, once said that animals don't have souls.
Rete terang ngacho chama ga teni soso rang ga terang ngacho kyoda teni lilita soso ga teni tsola namshi yo marezena te soso ga kelen ga mares.
However, if someone were to say that our own dogs and our own cats today don't have souls, then it wouldn't be something that many of us would be able to accept.
Then aranso logi ga tola teni ga norwa ga teni samlo mambo rimba jent mambo shungyoris.
So in the course of our intellectual history, there have been many stages of erroneous thought.
Yina teni ngaso teni noncher jang ka samlo te so mangboz ta ngaso getu jap sarwares.
Many of these erroneous thoughts we have already addressed and reformed.
Teni ngaso noncher ka teni samlo thamad kang rezena teni jamnyim mayim ba teni te thamad kang rezena teni ngaso madang chokchak ka bar ka teni jamnyim mayim ba tere te ngaso tarta yina tarong ngaso teni samlo toni getu jap to yo mares.
But one of the final areas of inequality in terms of our understanding of things is our attitude towards animals. And this is an area that we need urgently to reform.
Yina teni ta ngaso garti maung bala teni ngaso teni nyangji gomba tang jamnyim gu teni thola chama ga samlo tang tharna teni ngaso maung ba na chokchak la yang teni kwarang chola teni chogne ga rawa yak po yopa kwarang chogo topchang yak po yopa teni z teni ngaso teni shetab gres maung ba na.
However, if in the future we're all able to really adopt attitudes of compassion and equality towards animals, then we will automatically recognize their intrinsic rights and their right to survival.
Teni America ga teni mo teni khwepa chi ko teni chokchak jandur zige jefang dongwu zige teni ga tefchik teni jindik pe yak bondoks.
A Western writer penned a book called Animal Liberating.
Teni nge samlo tangna te nga so nurshok rigne ga nangla teni motso teni tendro la tartang la teni gerwan ropi ngut sambares.
And I regard this book as really the very beginning of a change in attitude towards animals in Western thought.
Teni te nga so yindam banda teni te tin jamnyim mayim ba te yindam banda nga so teni gerju jab goya zres.
And it's extremely necessary that we reform these attitudes of inequality between humans and animals.
Teni nga so chokchak sola teni nga so teni nyangji me sham nyangji me jamnyim she matangna teni nga so thar di teni samlo to yen rambo kum sona teni nga so mug nangla yang teni jamnyim mayim ba mambo yong gres.
Because if we aren't able to extend this attitude of compassion and equality towards animals, then the ultimate result will be negative repercussions in terms of relations between humans ourselves.
Teni chokchak la teni narchu shea ga teni te samlo to teni kum sona ti pachak ngamba to kum sona teni nga so shutso ko thola yang te chamgar ka leka mambo le gres.
As a result of our being accustomed to looking down on animals and degrading animals, it's left a great negative impression on us.
Te nga so America ga teni chamkang chi ka nangla te khoso go teni takshit chipshin dos.
And a lot of illegal behavior has resulted, and this is something that research has been conducted into.
Teni takshit kandishi parezina zongkang ti nangla yopi teni mo nagni hal lepa ga chimbo jang ga mo tisu nangni mo gyacha dunshit hambata teni chokchak la narchu shin ga mo tsures.
Within two prisons, among the criminals who were serving time there, 70% were there on account of having committed crimes against animals.
Teni ngacho ti nam yinna yang teni ngacho le soso moschige naja teni ngacho chimchangzge naja ngacho zhongkirzge naja ngacho shusogge naja ngarang chole rinpachi ga manken ge teni chokchak de chola ngacho samlo tango res.
So whether it's at our personal level or the level of a family, a city, society at large, then we really need to extend our thoughts to those animals who exist below us.
Teni ngarang chole rinpachi ga thongkeng ge teni moyen naja shusogge naja de chola ngacho samlo mambo tango mares.
Those who exist above us in society, those who are on higher rungs, are really not the people that we need to think about that much.
Teni ngacho nam inna yang teni ngacho teni to jamnyim de yong gona thomr ngacho ngarang cho rangle rinpachi ga manken ge teni simchen tela ten jamnyim go thotang chayate karchim bores.
So in terms of cultivating equality, it's really important to look at those beings who are lower than us and to extend a view of equality towards them.
Teni karti chorang choran we amma wi tini choran le nyam chung wi tini semchen tela rawang ga thoptang chongkeng ga moz yinna tini tazu tini choran la choran le thu wi tini mote dang ngani kan janda yongo ngani jamni yongo zini tini thoptang zoya ga tini thoptang zge thoptang de wutup de chola yores.
If you're able to look at those who are those beings who are lesser than you, weaker than you, more humble than you, and extend to them a view of equality, then at this point, only at this stage, will you be entitled or qualified indeed to regard yourself as equal with those above you.
Teni gardi chorang le nyam chungwi teni semchen tela rawang dan jamnyam teni to machine kang ga mateni yinna teni chorang lim thu yimtela ngarang la jamnyam go ngarang la rawang go zini teni shaya ga thoptang de yo wutup de yo mare ti zge wutup de yo mare.
If you are not someone who is able to extend or support the freedom and equality of those lower than you, then you are in no way entitled to demand that those above you respect your freedom and respect your equality.
Teni nga tsu murg chik nang la yin nang da yarkaf chik nang la yin nang da muni tang ni jamnyam da rawang yo ta me te teni nga tsu nyam chung chola ta go res.
So whether or not a particular society in question has compassion, whether it has equality, we assess this essentially by looking at those who are the most weak or disenfranchised in that society.
Tenji yendi teni terang nga tsu zambolang ka teni machang tongshir dunche thambala changmala teni shi chane samlo tana nga tsu le rinpa chik mamba de gang rezena teni tenjo tsu res.
In the context of today's world, where we've got a massive population of 7 billion people, those who essentially exist on the rung below us are animals.
Deyen sarti teni nga tsu mutso teni tenjo tsu la rawang ka thoptang dan jamnyam ka thoptang de nga tsu cha shina teni tazo nga tsu mutso nang pansel la teni jamnyam da tsu tsulnim shi la thoptang de yores.
And it's only by being able to extend the entitlement of freedom and equality to these animals that we as humans will really be able to embody freedom and equality among our own species.
Teni karti nga tsu teni droa mi rig namji teni chokchak tenro chola teni samlo tang jeta jamnyam ga teni thoptang chaya tela karti nga tsu samlo matang na te samlo tang mashina teni nga tsu nangla mui rig nangla o ngala jamnyam go ngala thoptang go ngala rawang go teni zia ga kaja de teni shanayang teni ti shapi wutup de yomares zge de yomares.
Because if we're really not able to really legitimately recognize and legitimately appreciate the entitlements of animals, those who are below us, then we've got absolutely no right to demand among humans ourselves that we be given our entitlements of freedom or equality or whatever they may be.
Teni tenji yenna teni nga tsu teni ngoni chane ga jamnyam ngomata teni tambo tenjo toni yong go res tenjo ne ngosum go res.
So really genuine equality has to begin at the level of animals.
Te yendi teni nga tsu thomar teni ta nga tsu tenjo chola teni jamnyam teni chone ga jamnyam nga tsu matang tenjo ni jacha gyan jamnyam yong go tse ga mare zi yenda chone ga jamnyam de chone ga tonin chone ga rawang ti ya buz ta go res.
So when we talk about equality between humans and animals, we're really not meaning perhaps equality in an absolute sense, but certainly from the point of view of equal entitlement to survival.
Tendi yendi teni ta di toni karzi ni teni ngosum go re nga tsu tomar tenjo namla teni jamnyam ta ne rawang cha chit kan rezena te nga tsu karzi za chit teni nga tsu shopa ga toni kha ga shapa mayen par nga tsu shopa ga toni o ta ne teni chokchak tso teni shaza ga men o tena nga tsu teni ta nga ra tsu teni mo ga na ti jamba za ma mambo yo re ne chokchak tso za men zi chit teni nga tsu jamnyam ta tenjo tso la teni jamnyam go wangcha chapi teni shawa shopa zangshu te teres.
And this is really where vegetarianism kicks in, because it's by being vegetarian and refraining from eating meat that we really, in substance, give animals their entitlement towards freedom and their entitlement to survival.
Derite ina nga cho tini roa mir tamshit tini karze tak tak zankin tini ko rendo gona te rek marez te yung chiki marez.
Whether or not all humans will become vegetarian is something that is probably highly unlikely.
Ina nga cho mriri ni nga cho rangli tini ngosum go ndos.
However, this is something that we really need to start with at the level of ourselves.
Tani thomi nekamna nga cho pe na bume ko tini rawang na ja tini mo nakpo rawang na ja te mayim pi nga cho zambalong ko tokla murk na la rawang mayim ba mambo yore te na thomar mo nyonshu ko gale tani mambo re ne tani jima tini chama ramnyum re songwa tani zres.
So whether it's in terms of women's empowerment or the empowerment of black people, all of these movements have really started off at the level of the individual. So it's at this level that we need to begin to, with our attitude, with our efforts to respect the equality of animals.
Tani tambo nga chu tini ramnyum go tini thopthang da nga chu Tsultrim shipi ne kamna tani tela tani tawan ramata tani shatsan ramata tani ngaskin ramata ti mambo ononshik ramata ti mambo yung wares.
However, in these initial stages, it is inevitable that there will be many voices, opposing ideas that we have to contend with.
Tani nga chu tundrola talugla nga chu tindi rese nga chu pe na khashe ge na nga chu tundrola tani khochola tani chechok tani choni rawang da trago ndo ge na ayang khashe ge na nga chu tarung mulayang tani nga chu chechok tani damnyu yo mari mena tundrola kala yo te go mare zi tindi zenken yo yores.
For example, there are some people who respond to the assertion that animals' right to survival needs to be respected by saying that, well, all humans have not yet essentially achieved this right. So this being the case, then, how can we really speak about this in terms of animals? The time is not really ripe until this situation has been achieved for humans. Unless we really take this kind of reasoning apart and look at it, scrutinize it very carefully, on the surface it seems like a reasonable kind of logic. However, the kind of reasoning dissipates or falls apart rather quickly when we give careful attention to it, for the reason that if we draw a really strong distinction between humans and animals and take this as legitimate, then by the same token we can draw distinctions between different kinds of human, and these kinds of distinctions will become legitimate in terms of our customs and cultural ways of thinking, and even in our legal system. There has been over the last century and still a lot of discussion of women's empowerment. However, it's not just simply focusing on this one area of inequality is by a long shot insufficient. We really need to direct our attention to residual areas of inequality that still linger, in particular inequality towards animals. In terms of vegetarianism, there are many levels of vegetarian lifestyle or practice.
답변나 가서 샘신 것들이 리폴리 용화 것들이 자마강양 마자라고 든지시 기대제 할리바 약보레스.
The strictest form of vegetarianism is a kind where no products from an animal are consumed at all, and this is an extremely strict and an extremely wonderful, positive form of vegetarianism.
Teni pena ngaso pena jans zawandawo ta teni ngaso chokchak teni lipole yongwa ina da yana chokchak teni korangso kaze mambo soyo ate ngaso monnam go chokne teni ngaso zaga yore tinguni tani shujok ngama ngaso shade shujok ze ate nguni tani teres.
So the consumption of honey, for example, honey is something that is taken directly from the body of the bee. It's a form of theft in actuality.
Yena ngaso monnamdi nangla chikisila shujok shena teni te dikjagrezine te zegre mato ba ngaso mchama tandrula shujok shena te ngaso dikboreze mndwasi.
Of course, when this kind of behavior is engaged in among humans, we consider it as extremely negative. However, when it's done against animals, we don't see anything particularly wrong with it. However, in actual fact, this kind of behavior is equally negative regardless of whether it's committed against humans or animals.
Chokchak lile shongwi teni chigteni pakpa makongwa dawota teni chokchak lile shongwi teni zama kanyang mazawan dawota penar jansi la sokpa simjan la nopa kyarni zam kanga zama mazawan dawota teni shijita hachanga san tumbu karzere hale bayak bores.
So the highest form of vegetarianism is this kind of vegetarianism where we don't use or appropriate anything that comes from an animal's body, whether it be their hide or food, as in the case of bees that is taken directly from them.
Teni karti tinji tini yakpo halipa santumbo mayongna teni ti marjibla tini ngaso perna simchen tini shamazawan dawota changmantongwan dawota teni simchen tini simchen tsi num mazawan daw teni yongna halipa yakbores.
If we're not able to practice this really high, this highest form of vegetarianism, then the next form would be a kind of vegetarianism where we don't consume animals' meat, blood, or their fat.
Then, that tesoyang teni tsawane mayona ta yinda banda shazagona teni ta ngaso chochak sumbu mazawa pena chirni chongchong daw teso yinangaso teni nya yinanda teni chirni chongchong teso sul halepa dbushini sanni zagore teni tmashina yapores.
But if we're really not able to give up eating meat entirely, then what we do need to refrain from is eating small animals who are still alive. So particularly things like seafood, which are caught live and are killed in the most, or they die the most appalling deaths. These kinds of animals we need to refrain from eating.
Teni ngaso teni halipa jiksurungwi teni shawa zuithan. Halipi teni jiksurungwa tana halipi duksub teni shawa teso tamche teni ngaranso zachokotoni chanju zachokotoni yongores.
The most cruel and barbaric form of diet is that which appears on our dinner table.
Teni ngaranso teni zachokotla yongken ge simjin mambo zut teni korang tarong sombores. Yena teni te sumbu te songa som mo teni te zaga yori sumbu so tola perna derma kanga nala teni te chochang mambo tarong teni khatak ji yongken teni ngi yongken teni ga nala nam sa khulugni te nga som mo zaga yoris.
These kind of food that arrives on the dinner table refers to people who consume small creatures that are still writhing, that are still moving, and then we kill them by immersing them in hot oil and then put them in our mouths.
Teni shirtang atso teni karzi shi goreta yena karzi pena makashi kajizaka ne karzi zago zathak mend ngarang sha gaboyo ne sha pangthak mend zena Then around go along and those Nangoliji.
There are some people who say that, you know, I just can't be vegetarianism. It's too difficult for me to give up meat. At one level, we can definitely understand this kind of feeling.
Yena ngatu teni zajo kotola tinji gteni semchen sola teni dungmerta diksebta ha lepa gteni to narchu tinji shene tela samlo motane zat tabjit te pen ngasu ti kwalung manduse te.
However, while we might be able to understand that some people are not able to give up eating meat, to imagine that people would be able to sit at a dinner table and consume animals in such a barbaric way is something that defies our capacity to empathize with people.
Pena ngaso chula tapa machine ka mambo yore machine na chobareze pena chorang na sanji shakata pala tapa machine na chokore chorang yishi chulula tapa machine na chokore te ngaso ko long nduse chama chula tapa sheng menzena te ngaso ko malon chi manduse.
There are lots of people without particular religious faith, so there's no insistence that anyone be Buddhist or that they be Christian or anything like this. In fact, the question of religious faith is something that we can accept rather easily. Whether or not a person wants to have faith in a particular religion or another, or doesn't want to have faith in any religion at all, is a very easy kind of question for us to accept. It's not a big issue. It's a very everyday kind of decision that belongs to the individual. So, not having a faith or belief in a particular religion, there is no problem whatsoever. However, in terms of live beings that arrive on the dinner table, then this is something that anybody can perceive to be suffering, to be in a state of great pain, and to be just like us, really wishing not to be in this situation of having inflicted torture on them, and just like us to prefer a situation where this is not happening.
Then ti Gimson Carrezi, Nazo de Kosola, Tinazo, Zacho Tola, Yungan, Choshak Tesola, Dumur Yo, the Nicoranzo, Dumuriona, Mundud, Coranzo, Devayona, Tenindo, Tendi Hinayam, Maranzo Tini, Tilam Tonchon Shini, then Gandhi Zasana, Zacho, then Gandhi Kosola, Dumurtana, Tachopi, Gimson de Carrezi.
However, the fact that despite that we can perceive these beings in a state of great suffering and discomfort, the fact that we don't turn our minds to it is an extremely strange thing indeed. And in fact, this is a very big problem.
Then Aranso land job grazing, also Manchi land kind of job grazing, not Murezi, then Coranzo Tundu Rezi, or the Ning is Achocorezi, then land job grazing.
And if we were to ask people, you know, why is it that you can perceive with your own two eyes the suffering of this animal and yet you still continue to eat them in this most savage way, how is it that you permit yourself to do this? Most people would answer, it's because I am a human and it is just an animal.
The choppy Jimson de Carraising, also telling us a million Nathan Rosa Jimson de Carraising, also Ranatra go race.
What we need to ask ourselves is that how is it though that we have a sense of entitlement to eat animals and consume them in this way just because we are humans? This is a question we need to pose to ourselves.
Then it like Jimson Daniel Jambachi or Marezi, telling Aransola Gurmu Yose, Narangatini Tezana, telling Arante Zachek, Nibati Yose, Shirley. Or Naranti Nipa de Ore, Disturb the Ore, the ending is our Rezi Kamato Jamba, 요 말이지. 가서 지지 점선 요 말. 니르 요 말이지.
But actually there is no reason, there is no logic to justify why we are entitled to eat these other beings, except for the fact that we have money, and on account of having money we have purchased these beings, and so we have power, we have force, and we exert it by eating them.
Teni karti te jimsen ta nilig yenna, karti te nilig ze yenna, teni nyimachig la ngatso teni karma jang tola yong keng mo wai xin ren. Karma jang tola yong keng mo yong ne teni ngatso sang ma zasuna, teni ngarang so ti kaps kandi lan jab gore, ngatso o ti zana chokore, korang la te ngatso zawi nipa to korang la yore, ti zana ndgre, ti ze gore ze ngatso.
However, if we were to apply this logic to a situation, this same logic to a situation where aliens were to arrive on Earth and want to gobble us up, then really what would we have to say aside from, would we in fact say to them, yes, that's okay, you can do what you want because you have power, you have the entitlement to eat us? Would we say this? But of course we would not. At this moment we would say, this is terrible, this is inequality. We would complain very loudly that these aliens were oppressing us, that they were invading our planet, and we would protest very vehemently. We would say that this is absolutely not in accordance with the proper way things should be. It's absolutely not in accordance with the law. It defies all the proper standards and norms. If we would see aliens coming and eating us in this way as an extremely grievous case of inequality, then by the same logic, we as humans consuming animals in this way is exactly the same. And if we aren't indeed able to extend this view towards animals, then human equality will not be achieved. Our view of equality really is about whether or not, if my quite often we regard equality as being when everything is going in accordance with our desires, or when our own wants are being satisfied. And when that is not happening, then we start to claim that things are unequal. So genuine equality really needs to begin from vegetarianism. And genuine compassion needs to begin from animals. So for this reason, compassion and vegetarianism have a great connection. Usually everything that we say, everything that we do, everything that we think about is done so from our own personal perspective.
Tindri yansardi tini ngazo tini tindri tatashina tini ngazo kale mo nanglayang tini yewa mambo yore se ngazo tini mo napo mo karo mo sero tini zamalang ke sharsho no show tini nanglayang rig mambo ye ona tini mambo yore se mo nanglayang.
And it's really by viewing the world in this way from our own individual perspective that we then start to have all kinds of divisions and distinctions emerge between different people. People of different races, people of different ethnicities, people from the West, people from the East. And when everyone is speaking from their own vantage point, whether that be the vantage point of a human, the vantage point of a man, the vantage point of a person of color, the vantage point of somebody else, then we really can't see a situation where general equality will prevail in the world.
Teni ngazo tartate na pena ngazo menyamchung zlatini ropa zshi menyamchung zlatini dongsim nyamki tini zshina teni ngazo motsama yakboreze tini zegres.
Genuinely, when we show empathy to people who are less fortunate than ourselves, most people endorse this and regard it as extremely good.
Teni ngazo karti tendrola teni ropa sheketang tendrola dongsim nyamki sheketa tini zshina teni ngazo mambozuka o te gubachim bundukze tini zegres.
But many people would not see the same need in respect of animals. They would not see that animals necessarily were equally as worthy of empathy.
Tenji tawate la tinni, teni ngazo lan jamni mayempa teni kipa pomo lan jamni mayempa, mukaro nokpo lan jamni mayempa, teni garo nangena nakpo nangena teni ngazo zambalang ke sharshoko ina mugnala murg soso na lan jamni mayempa mambo jongata, ten jawi tawate la tinni shongares.
So the fact that we don't have a view of equality towards animals is manifested or related to then the inequality that we have in terms of gender, ethnic equality, racial equality, etc. And it's this kind of attitude or view that of equality and intrinsic inequality between people that we really need to eliminate. If we're going to do away with this view or attitude that divides people up and asserts an inequality between them, the best method we can apply, the best approach we can apply is compassion. So I've spoken just now about the importance of vegetarianism, and I'd like to go on now and talk about the importance of compassion. Compassion is a word that among Buddhists is spoken of absolutely all the time, very, very frequently. In fact, compassion is the soul of the Mahayana tradition. And it's also the foundation of the Mahayana tradition. So in terms of understanding what compassion actually means or represents, we need to grasp essentially two things about it. The first part of compassion is the understanding, is generating an understanding of the suffering of other beings, not just the suffering of humans, but also the suffering of animals. And this is a kind of understanding, this understanding of suffering is something that is very rare, in fact, among humans. For example, many rich people have no idea about the suffering, the nature of suffering of those who are in poverty. And those who have great power and privileges in society have no understanding at all of those who are disenfranchised and powerless. And those who are in robust and good health have no understanding or little understanding of those who are sick. And in general, humans have very little understanding of the suffering of animals. And the reason for this is that we frequently and accustomedly neglect the suffering of others. And so on account of this neglect that we pay to the suffering of others, their suffering doesn't really come into our view. It's not something that we generally or regularly pay attention to. However, one thing that we do pay an extraordinary amount of attention to is, in fact, our own suffering. And in respect of our own suffering, if even the slightest, smallest, most trivial kind of suffering arrives on us, then we wish it away, we wish it weren't happening. And the one thing that we do pay a great deal of importance to and place great priority on is our own sense of happiness. And so in terms of happiness and pleasure, it's something, or clearly great pleasure or great joy is something that everyone would wish for, but even small forms of happiness and pleasure are something that we would want to have, would want to enjoy. But in actual fact, it's not just ourselves who are like this. In fact, every other human being and every other living being, in fact, feels exactly the same. However, we really never turn our attention to whether other people are feeling like this. However, even though we see and hear very often stories about people dying in earthquakes, people dying in air accidents or sea accidents, we really don't pay great attention to this suffering. We dismiss it rather easily. We say or acknowledge, with a passing remark that this has happened, but it's not something that we really take to our mind or take to our hearts. And this reason is because we don't pay attention to others. We don't prioritize them and their suffering. And in fact, states like sickness, poverty, powerlessness are really only things that we understand when they finally happen to ourselves.
Tini te nga tsu mu tsama te nga tsu mu chik kyun mare ze murg chik kyun ya mare nga tsu mu tsama tindi reze.
And this is not a shortcoming of, just one person. It's not the shortcoming of one ethnicity or one nationality. In fact, this is a shortcoming that all humans possess.
Tini yemba shenna te nga tsu mi rangjin de tindi mu shika de tindi zreta yena ti shika te girna girchu jamna girki yores.
Whilst we might say that this is human nature, as to whether this human nature is able to be changed, whether it's able to be transformed, yes, it absolutely is able to be transformed.
Tini ti girchu gyapki te tini lerji chembo zrese ta gongchen ajang chembo zrese.
But however, this process of transformation is a big project, a big undertaking indeed.
Yena nga tsu ka te telam bachum shena tini te njamjo rese.
However, if this is something that we apply ourselves to with great diligence, then we will be able to achieve it.
Tani bachung kandishi go rezena nga tsu nyarji gumbi nekavna tani nga tsu namgin tani perna moyen nanja tandro yen nanja tani kocho dumur mambo yongkang mate sola nga tsu mukta nawa nyanni tani semga nala samlo mambo tango reze kocho dumur te kandi ndu samne samlo mambo tango reze.
And the way that we really need to go about this transformation is by engaging in the compassionate contemplation, really perceiving, really when we apprehend with our eyes and apprehend with our ears the sight and the predicament of people suffering or other living beings suffering before us. This is something that we need to face square on.
소소고티니 섭족연난자 소소고 레족연난자 초아가 나라 남긴 가서 문나라 등물 mambo 용와데 가서 묶음 통거요래 나와 토요래지 요나 띠값스티니 가서 고추 등물 때라 상로 mambo 땅고 그래서.
And even though it's quite common for us to see suffering in the lives of those around us, whether it be our fellow students or our colleagues or whatever, what we need to do is when we see this, when we perceive this, we hear about their suffering and we see their suffering, observe their suffering, we need to really think about it very, very, contemplate it very, very deeply. Thinking about other people's suffering, contemplating their suffering, working to alleviate their suffering, all of these things are things that we need to really learn how to do.
Tani lojong shiatila tini korang nga tsuti wena namba nalayana namba thapa chimbo nalayana tini korang tini jondr shia ti samlo tansar ke tini jondr shia tini thapshi ta gumthap ta haleba mambo yorese namba nala.
And in terms of this process of learning or study, there are a great many methods and approaches in the Buddhist tradition that can be taken to generate this kind of compassion.
Tani kyorang nangba chula tapa mashina chokore kyorang rang nangba chupata nangba lomata nangba jinji tani is mashina chokore kyorang she masam na jugurezi yena nangba thapshi te kyorang ko peshat tangna rangla pantok yores.
You don't have to be of Buddhist faith, you don't have to be a follower of Buddhism, and yet you should still avail yourself of, or feel able to avail yourself of Buddhist approaches and techniques because they will bring you great benefit.
Teni jondr shetsirti karezina perna ngaso teni senjin teni hajang napa nak dumar halipa chimbo yongken teni nanja. Yana ngaso perna senjin chikteni korang ko stokjani ta perna shirang nani ta senjin teni ta ta stokjan kan teni stokja kan yongken teni teni senjin dumar hajang chimbo yongken nanja. Teni zela teni muktani teni ko dumar to tambo hako gores.
So when we do encounter a being that is suffering very, very intensely, such as an animal who has been delivered to a slaughterhouse and is in a state of great suffering, then this is something that we really need to look at very squarely with our own two eyes.
Teni the Samlo Tangdi, Teni Nazo, Korala Dumur Chimbondu, somebody Nazo Hakodores.
And it's by doing this that we will be able to fully understand that this being is undergoing great suffering indeed.
Teni Hako Caps, Teni Nazo, Teni Randa Geni Par Gini Samlo Tango, Pena, Natini Korang Yena, Simpson Dumur Jandekati, Naina, Ne country Shesare, Ne Dumur de country Shinetini, Tini Nyansunona country and Sare, some Tesam Gores.
And it's after we've apprehended or come to really see the suffering of this being that we will then be able to exchange ourselves for this animal, put ourselves in their position and think, what if that animal suffering right now were me? What would I do in that situation? What would it be like?
Yana, Pena Simpson Dumur Haliba Dumur Chimbo, Younger Yonkan Simpson Day, Ne Pai in a country in the Usam, Ne Mai in a country in the Usam.
Or instead of putting ourselves in the animal's position, we might really think, what if that animal were my mother or my father or one of my children? And by doing this, we'll be able to arouse a really new kind of feeling. And by being able to do this, then we will really be able to begin to arouse empathy for others in this lifetime. By really thinking or trading ourselves for the position of the animal in suffering, who is in the process of suffering, or by imagining that it was one of our parents or our children, then we should feel a feeling of intense fear or terror as a result. And it's this feeling, the arousing of this feeling, that is the first stage of compassion, the practice of compassion. And from here we proceed to the second stage.
Simpson Dumur Jadang, ni Pata Mari, ni Maya Mare, the Ningi Pota Pomboya Mari, Nara Mare, Mariti Yana Penangara, Hankatini Dumur Mundut, Devan Dot, Tendi Yambajanda, then is Simpson Teang, Koran Dumur Mundunkin, Devan Dunkin, then is Reti Channing at on Damure, some gores.
And by moving on to this second stage or second step, we recognize that this animal who is currently suffering isn't ourselves. It's not our mother or father, and it's not our one of our children. However, at the same time, this animal is exactly the same as ourselves in respect of not desiring suffering anyway, and only desiring, in fact, happiness for ourselves, for itself.
Otan jamnim re samne ngason jamnim re teni koyang teni pena simchin doyang korang dumur mena sam gare deva yona sam gare reti yena teni ta korang la rawa me pa toni teni dumur teni mamboz teni nyongdo teni deva nyong mandu samne te yang da samlo tango res.
And so we really need to constantly contemplate, constantly reflect on the fact that the animal in the situation of suffering is in no way desiring this suffering, and yet is being placed in a situation of utter powerlessness where all kinds of terrible things and suffering and torture is being inflicted on it.
Saman Jamna, Pena Narang Latini Dumur Mena Narang Ga, Deva Yona Narang Ga, Division the Jambala, Jamnimre, Te Indi, Tini Jambati Lion, Tini Dumur the Mesona, Sanangazo Simganala, Tini Simganala, Tini Revati Yungores, or Simchin Tela, Napazina, Koran Naki Dumur the Mesona, Narang, Gatini, Simganala, Revati Yungores.
And it's by being able to extend this view of profound equality between ourselves and other beings, the animal in suffering, insofar as it, just like ourselves, is in no way desiring suffering and is in every way desiring happiness, that we are able to generate a profound desire or aspiration that the animal not be in suffering, that it leave this state.
Pena tambo or simjin te korangla dungur mesona samje dungur te mesona yabundu samji tini samlo te kegre tini tela kale samlo tana tini ngaso semganala otangi dungur te mesona samne molom jaba samji panto komendu teyena tini simjin ti dungur te ngi meba chegen samne tini samlo yungres.
And so it's through this generating this desire that the animal be free of suffering, that it obtain happiness, through generating this desire then, that we then resona samne semganala samba samji pantong mandu tena tini semjeng ti dumurte nge mepa shegi yanze ne ti dumurte mepa tonde tini nge shawaleka dribge yanze paru po dumurte nge par mepa shego nge te leka nge lego samba tini samlo yongres. However, realizing the nature of the suffering of the animal in question, we nevertheless understand or recognize that our prayers for its well-being, that our prayers for its freedom are in themselves not sufficient. So on this basis, we generate the aspiration to engage in concrete action to help this animal be free from suffering, to eliminate its suffering. And if we really contemplate in this manner over these thoughts many times, time and time again, then our aspiration, the strength of that aspiration will only grow. And it's at this point that we can be considered to have generated compassion. And it's from this day onwards then that we become altruistic persons, people who are dedicated to the benefit of others.
Samlo tangare jang dungur me pa to langa so kaja shakare jang dungur me pa to langa so lekal drip kare ziti panchone.
And from this point onwards, we are people who really work and strive to benefit other beings, to help them be free from suffering, and we do this not only in terms of our speech, the things we say, but also in terms of concrete actions and things that we work that we undertake.
Tani di kapsa tani ngarang so ngune tane nga so muse gnang ni tani vishchit zerwat tani nga so janpan dripa jantun dripa tin ani yongres.
And it's at this point that our happiness in life becomes, or that we achieve our happiness in our life, that we derive it in fact from benefiting others.
Pena nga so mo ni tani ta nga so chik shawa chigla tani dondak chik tola nga so mo ni chopa jamni Deni pena kefsang, pena chung kefsang tawazo na nga so mo ni ti tola chopa jamne ti kefsang de nge rak sona paru potila kefsang de mepare sona nga so ti kef chigla nga so semde te demo da keponda yongres.
So it's like, for example, engaging in a kind of an argument over the business profits from business. Whether or not I take it, or whether or not I receive it, or whether or not another receives it. However, in the process of engaging in competition for these profits or benefits, then in fact if one is harmed in this process, then unhappiness and displeasure results.
Teni kate ngaso jan la pamba te drna jan la panto kan ke tini shawale ka te lena pena terang ke nyama chila ngarang ke jan la panto kan ke samba le ka te le jan la panto kan ke tini kaja shat shawa dr tini she jana tini ngarang so terang pena ngarang chimla tini ro sarvi chi sange samlo ta ngarang ke semba na halepa kipu yung ke chora halepa kipu yung kres.
So whereas engaging in competition for with the goal of obtaining benefit oneself can lead to great unhappiness and displeasure, if we were on the other hand to dedicate ourselves in our daily work to benefiting others, bringing them happiness, etc., then when we retire to our own homes at the end of the day, we would only experience happiness.
Di goni teni ta ngaso shertang namgin ina ngaso samlo tana ngar rang ton la samlo mampo tana ngara ke poyong gore teni sam gore ta tin norwares.
So the idea that happiness for myself will come by really doing a lot of work for myself and being very diligent in benefiting myself, this idea is in fact mistaken, erroneous.
Teni ngaso jang ton la samlo tani jampan drumna ngaranchu samna nge jala japshi jegoyo nge jala phambatan deva legoyo samni titi samgreta tun ngomati rangla tini phambayong dos.
So the idea that by working for the benefit of others, one is essentially working in their service, is essentially bringing them happiness and not one's own happiness. This is also mistaken. In actual fact, by working for the benefit of others and bringing them happiness, one is in fact working for one's own happiness.
Teni te nyanchi gomluk te teni rezi teni me terang ngochu shipati teni halipa tabdepo nyonyo yes.
So these two stages that I've introduced tonight is a very abbreviated and simple form, easily able to be practiced form of compassion practice.
Teni tarung te teni chi gepong dawo ta yana chi jipcha dawo teni kyoranso go shinan dona teni namba go thapa chembo teni shyamda nyanji.
And if you'd like to learn more about compassionate practice, learn about it in a more detailed way, then you can certainly turn to the teachings in the Mahayana tradition, which are very rich in this area.
Teni ngatsu janla samlo tangwata, jang dirdigla samlo tangyata. Teni devasgina devata kipa yena ngatsu para janla teni jenshipati.
So it's extremely important that we work towards benefiting others, that we give them happiness, that we work towards their benefit. The Mahayana tradition talks about needing to give happiness to others and to take on oneself their suffering.
Teni ngacho mamboz ka samlo tana ngacho deshi tup ka mare ngarang deva janla jinna ti ngarang deva me pare ndore janji dumar ngarang lenna ti ngarang dumar ndore samne tendi sam gre rete tendi mares.
There are many people who think that this is not something that they would be able to do. If they were to give their happiness to others, then they would be left with no happiness themselves. By the same logic, if they were to take on the suffering of others, they'd make themselves very unhappy. However, this kind of reasoning is in fact not correct. In actual fact, by giving one's happiness to others, one only increases one's happiness. And by being able to generate the desire to take on another's suffering, will in no way lead to suffering oneself. Being really able to generate the desire and the aspiration to take on the suffering of others, to take it onto oneself, will only in fact lead to one's own happiness.
Teni ngaso zambalang ka tini lobcha teni ta chapat te pen America ka lobcha thorum ko lobcha so nangla teni ngaso changru teni laksar teni chongle pamjur ko kor teni ke shirk ta teni shion ta laksar ko kor ta hale pa mambo lab ko yores.
In terms of universities and colleges, a great deal is taught about, or a great deal of knowledge and skills are taught in fields such as science, technology, economics, business.
Tin zambalang la shikin hale pa chimbo thip ko yores.
And on account of this, this practice has really impacted on the world in a very significant way.
Yena ngarang so teni te losun din nangla teni shion da laksar teni lobke ma tok ba jampan da teni te samba zambo loso te te nyung nyung res.
But whereas we really emphasize the study of science, the study of technology and other fields of knowledge, we put rather less emphasis on benefiting others and compassion.
Teni tenji loso te nge samlo tana te la nyenka ha chang chimbo nduk sam ko yos.
And this kind of education is in fact very dangerous.
Te kare se na ngarang so rang ndo pa dwya go shion da rang ndo pa dwya go laksar ta te so nga so mambo teni chama lapsar songos lapsar waris. So rang te so rang ndo pa dwya go shir so rang ndo pa dwya go teni laksar to so mambo shigres ta chama mambo shigres.
Mynde sona choka.
The Natsu Rang Dopa Dryasina Kopa, Natsu Rang Randu Drishik Tini Laster, Randu Drishik Shir, the Natsu Samaga Lobjagan Lojon in the Mambo Shigres. Tarko.
That did mitten this on the thing.
Oh, yeah, the Shigres, Natsu Rang Dopa Drya, Randu Drishik Shirta, Randu Drishik Lasterta, the Sunatsu Samaga Mambo Shigres.
All of us know a lot about how to So in universities and institutions of higher learning today, everybody, in fact, it's very widespread, the studying for the sake of fulfilling one's own desires, regardless of what field of knowledge that might be. But without the aspiration to use one's study and attainments for the benefit of others, then we will arrive in a very dangerous place. And the result of this will be in the future that the world's resources will become scarcer and scarcer.
Teni ti kapsa nga so samaga rang tini chemboz tini ngarang top go samba jalla goji fenxiang jalla goji go samlo jalla gosha gyap go samlo ramnyim go samlo to mayuna teni nga so thon khong go tola chopa gyamne teni samlang go chikba dan chikda teni to mambo yongres.
And if at this time people, humans, insist on monopolizing resources for themselves, their own selfish interest, and refuse to distribute or share these resources fairly among others, then great conflicts and struggles over the distribution of resources will ensue, and all kinds of wars and conflicts will break out in the world.
Shiunda laksar tini lojon shepatang nyamde tani ngacho samba zambo shepatang nyarji gombatang merjanji dumur la samlo tangata jamnyimda titsu hoso te yang halepa gosari samgedus.
So in addition to studying knowledge and skills in our education systems today, it's equally important that we learn about compassion, benefiting others, equality, and apply these in tandem.
Teni nga tso mo gir kan chowa ga nang la sang lo tang ba yin na yang nga tso siam nyang ji te yang po zu gom shina teni zong ti nga tso mo gir kan chowa te yang teni dishti tang dan ba ze ren zhong de nga rang tso mo chi te yang ton tang dan ba ze ren zhong de.
And if one is able to practice compassionate contemplation in one's life, then not only will it bring great happiness at the personal or individual level, it will also bring great meaning to one's life in general.
And
this brings to a conclusion my talk tonight. Thank you everyone for listening.